we'll talk about the movie Elvis, which I watched over the weekend when we come back. Let us welcome to the show and leader of the opposition. I guess it's the biggest party, certainly the leader of the Labour Party, Chris Hipkins, joins us. Chris, good evening to you, sir.
Good evening. How are you?
Yeah, good. Are you the leader of the opposition when there are multiple oppositional parties? Do they have the biggest party tend to be called that, or how is there a title for that?
Yeah, the biggest party, the leader of the biggest non-government party is the leader of the opposition.
Okay. So, all right. Leader of the opposition, leader of the Labour Party, former Prime Minister. I like watching American politics, Chris, and when you leave office, they still use your title. So, they talk about Clinton being President Clinton or his wife being, Madam Secretary. They still keep them their titles. We don't do that that way. You're not still Prime Minister Chris Hipkins. They don't can you that. It's always formal for us. I think it's an interesting way that the Americans do it.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, I don't know, it's a bit less pretentious the way we do it, though. I kind of quite like the fact that we don't sort of have those kind of conventions. I think it's quite nice that you get to just go back to being a normal person again.
Do you, though? Is that possible? I mean, there's one person in politics over the last 20 years that you know very well, probably Jacinda Ardern, who possibly will never get a chance to go back to a normal life. But for most of you, you can?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, you're much more recognisable. When I'm down at the local pack and save, I still get lots of people coming up to me and wanting to have a chat. But for the most part, they're pretty friendly. You get the odd person who comes up and says, I hate you and I hate your government, or I hated your government. But that's actually, I mean, if you have 20 interactions with someone, one of them might be like that, and the rest of them are generally pretty friendly.
Even though we haven't done this week, Chris, movie? Did you see a movie? What's the last movie you saw? I saw Elvis in the weekend. We normally talk about what we did in the weekend. You got one? What have you seen recently?
Well, I've had this wonderful new blended family thing going on, and one of the people in that family is a Star Wars fanatic. So I'm being encouraged to watch Star Wars from the very beginning. So we're actually finally up to the very first Star Wars made, which was A New Hope, which is what we watched. But I had to watch all of the other newer, earlier ones because we're watching them chronologically. So we watched A New Hope the other night. So there you go.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, I've done that recently as well. In fact, I just started watching. I watched, in fact, Rogue One the other day, which I really like as an independent movie, to say how those plans got in the droid before Princess Leia got it. I thought it was a cool little self-enclosed bit as well. All right. Have we got any other questions, Chewy, or should we wrap up for the night?
No, that's it. Covered all the important stuff.
Hey, I'm going to play some. What we do here, Chris, is we often use audio and video made by real media people, and then we speak to it. I want to play something for you right now that was on One News this evening about what many people are calling a broken promise by the current government. Have a listen to this.
Cancer advocate Malcolm Mulholland says a government promised the cost would be covered by reintroducing the $5 prescription charge. Christopher Luxon accepts people's lives are at stake.
We are working really hard on it. There's a number of options available to us, which we're working our way through, so that actually when we procure those drugs, we've got them in a sustainable way and we deliver them consistently for New Zealanders going forward.
So we couldn't do that thing that we promised we'd do because we're not ready to do it. We have to figure it out. So we'll figure it out sometime soon. And whilst we're doing that, a bunch more New Zealanders will die. Would you like to speak to that, Mr. Hipkins?
Well, I mean, I think it was the wrong thing to promise during an election campaign. I think when you're talking about a matter of life and death, promising people access to particular drugs in exchange for their votes, I think is really cynical politics. And I also think it's not territory that New Zealand politics has gone into much before. There have been one or two examples, and I think of there have been a few where a particular drug has become an election campaigning football. And I think that's really unfortunate, because if you look, say, to the States, for example, where the pharmaceutical lobby are big political contributors, they donate heavily to political campaigns. You get to the point where politicians promise access to drugs based on the strength of the pharmaceutical lobby and the size, and who's contributing to their campaigns and those sorts of things. New Zealand doesn't have that. We have Pharmac, who make decisions about which drugs get funded and which don't. So I think that, the National Party shouldn't have gone down this road, because I think it's actually a dangerous road to go down. But having promised people access to 13 new cancer drugs, to then say, oh, well, we're not quite sure how we're going to do that, when for those people it literally is a matter of life and death.
Yeah.
I think that's just cruel. So you dangle this big carrot in front of them, and a lot of people got really excited about that, and then to sort of snatch that away and say, well, we're just not sure how we're going to do it. The reality is it was always going to be a difficult promise for them to keep, because they shouldn't have made it. But having made it, they should have figured out a way of delivering it.
Really random question. Could one consider this a verbal contract? We're always told that verbal contracts in law are the same as written contracts. If you get told, I will do A if you do B, and you do B and then they don't do A, I mean, has anyone ever actually tested that?
Unfortunately, sort of the parliamentary democracy doesn't quite work that way. When you vote, it is very much a case of you're voting for people based on their honesty and their integrity. And if they make a bunch of promises that they then don't keep, your only real recourse is to not vote for them again at the next election. This government seemed to be taking an attitude that actually democracy is something that only happens every 3 years. In other words, if you don't like it, well, you can just lump it for the next 2.5 years and then don't vote for us when the next election rolls around. I actually think that's a pretty narrow way of thinking about democracy. I actually think that, there is a responsibility for governments to actually be consulting people and talking to people right the way through the 3-year parliamentary term, taking on board that feedback. We did some stuff that was controversial, but we still made sure that people had the opportunity to have their say on it during that time. We didn't just say, oh, well, if you don't like it, you've just got to wait 3 years before you can do anything about it.
Yeah. Do you take that also as a lesson for you guys? I mean, there's no actually getting around that. There was a hammering last year in the election. So is that what you guys are going to be doing for this 3 years? Actually listening to the voters, talking to the voters? I mean, I had to laugh watching Q&A over the weekend, and me and Troy might look at that a bit later on tonight, when Nicola Willis was asked, why are you doing these tax cuts? And she said, well, because I spoke to lots of New Zealanders and told them I was going to do tax cuts, and that's why. But I mean, I'm taking the piss a bit, but in all reality, is that what this 3 years out of government is? A time to kind of regroup, reprioritize, look to what the voters are saying and get to it again?
Yeah, it's kind of a difficult and yet interesting period for us, because obviously we're not in government, so we don't have the day-to-day decision making. So that does open up some space to talk to interesting people, to read, to come up with some new ideas and some new thinking on the challenges the country faces. The reason I say it can be challenging is because after an election loss like that, you get a series of contradictory demands placed on you. So you get people who say, why did you lose? You're not listening to people. You need to get out there and you need to listen to people about why you've lost. But then those same people will often then be saying, you need to go be faster in committing to do X, Y, and Z and this particular thing that I want you to do. You can't actually do both of those things. You can't say, well, we're going to go out there and listen to people and we're going to start announcing a whole lot of new policy immediately off the hoof without actually going through that exercise of getting out there and listening to people. So you kind of got to get the balance right. So we are doing a bit of reflection, over the 6-year period that we're in government. There's a lot that we did that I'm really proud of. But if I could go back and do it again, there are undoubtedly things that we'd look at and go, we should have done some things a bit differently. And so, now's our chance to do that. And I guess the other thing that makes life interesting is that the 2026 election campaign won't be a rerun of the 2023 election campaign. There'll be the world moves on and people's lives move on, and the things that people are looking for from politics will be a bit different in 2026 to in 2023. Having said that, the big challenges the country faces are still going to be there. We've got a massive growth in inequality over the last 40 years that actually contributes to so many of the things people are concerned about. If we want to talk about the fact that we've got increasing violent crime, we've got increasing challenges in things like school achievement, we've got increasing health problems in some areas of the community. Actually, inequality is a huge contributor to that, and the 40 odd years of the current economic way of thinking and to thinking about the economy has really just left increasing numbers of people behind. And we have to have, I think, come 2026, we need some better answers to that than the ones that we've had so far.
Yeah. You talk about you go out and talk to people before you make legislations. Have you not heard of this thing called fast tracking? There's this group in right now that don't seem to want to do that so much. And I will say as well, Chewy, you'll jump in after this question, mate, is that it feels like from our side looking in, and look, we display our bias on our sleeve. We vote left, we're on the left, but we call balls and strikes, right? That's where we sit politically. It's so we look at what's going on and we think from commentators, from communicators, from broadcasters, what could and should be getting said by the left in general to help out. It's good to now hear that the right, and I know this is oversimplifying it left and right, it's not quite like that, but the right is now finally saying they're making choices. Again, on that Q&A show, Nicola Willis admitted that they're making choices. And the thing that it feels like for us that must never be left behind by the left in this election cycle is no matter what the government says, there's always this big looming choice of you can't afford it, but you gave $3 billion to landlords. You can't afford 280 million for cancer drugs, to come back to the start of this conversation. It was over 4 years as well. So that's what, 70 million a year, 7 4s are 28, is that right? So that's 70 million a year whilst you're giving 3 billion back to landlords. And I hope that the left, every answer for the next 2.5 years, every time the government talks about budgets and not being able to, every single time they go, own it. You got to fucking own it. Because if you don't own it, then you haven't got a real conversation. You guys gave $3 billion back to landlords whilst you let these people die, literally dying, no hyperbole here, literally die for 70 million. And now, when it's impacting you in the, sorry, I'm feeling a bit head up here. When it's impacting you in the polls and there's a backlash, all of a sudden, we are going to do it, but we still are going to do it. It's like, no, you don't get a do-over. You don't get a mulligan like in golf. And I just really hope you guys grasp that and just, everything that goes on when there's another cyclone and we don't have enough money. Well, $3 billion back to landlords again and again and again and again and again. I don't know. I feel it's fair to let you respond to that, Chris, before Chewy jumps in. So feel free, sir.
You're absolutely right. Look, every government budget's about choices, right? And so they've chosen to prioritise $2.9 billion, nearly $3 billion worth of tax cuts for landlords. And every time Nicola Willis or Christopher Luxon say, we had to make choices, we couldn't afford this or we couldn't afford that, actually they should be a bit more upfront and say we prioritise tax cuts and we'll prioritise tax cuts for landlords over doing those other things. Because the reality is there are many, many things that they could have done for that money, and they've just made bad choices. But the other thing is, if you look at the cuts, I've got to say that the language that they're using is it's patronising and offensive. When they talk about we're ending the dumb stuff, we're ending the wasteful spending. Well, they've cut $1 billion out of the maintenance budget for state houses. Now, that's not dumb stuff. That's not wasteful spending. That's making sure that our state houses are properly maintained. These are we've got billions and billions of dollars worth of them. And as a good landlord, we should be making sure they're maintained. They've done this before. And the end result was that we ended up with people, not having a roof over their head, living in cars, and state houses that were moldy, damp, and miserable. So, what they call dumb stuff and wasteful spending isn't. Cutting funding for science and innovation isn't wasteful spending. It's actually where some of the jobs of the future are going to come from. And I just think that so much of what they're doing is so short-sighted. They're taking money out of things that are going to have a long-term payback for the country to pay for what are very short-term priorities.
Yeah. Chewy, sorry, I'm going to throw one more thing there. I know I'm dominating this, so I apologize.
No worries.
Because it just speaks directly to what you've just said, Chris. The dumb stuff, the backroom stuff, that's not important. Police minister has come out today assuring staff cuts will not affect the front line. The police minister is saying this. I've actually got the clip with Mr. Luxon on breakfast this morning, but I won't play it. The Minister of Police said he's been assured that the loss of nearly 200 corporate support roles in addition to over 200 vacant positions from a recruitment freeze will not affect the front line. Staff revealed last week the following, that the government's budget police commissioner Andrew Costa told the government had also asked police to deliver $55 million worth of savings by reducing corporate support functions. This would mean about 175 jobs. There's also a part in this story, and I've missed it, haven't I, where basically the police commissioner has said it actually would impact frontline staff. And there was an example given where the transcription services was one of the dumb things. There's been an example due to workload. They are no longer typing notebooks entries for court. This falls back onto the officer in charge. So the police commissioner is actually saying this is going to impact frontline staff. The government saying, no, it won't. Police commissioner saying, yeah, it will. And one of the examples they've given is people who transcribe out the notepads which now the police officers are going to have to do. So a police officer is going to have to use his or her notepad, come back to the office, and then with his 2 big fat fingers, type out the report because all the transcribers have been fired. And this is what this government's calling dumb stuff and backroom stuff that's not going to impact the front line. So it's completely frustrating.
Well, the back office frontline distinction is just a complete nonsense anyway. I mean, I don't know how they came up with that. And this idea that, you know, all of our public servants are just people sitting behind desks in Wellington, you know,2 up new ways to make life complicated for people is just absolute nonsense as well. You know, about, it's the 4th of June. So about 2 years ago, almost exactly, I became Minister of Police. And one of the first things I did as Minister of Police was go around and visit every police district in the country. And so I spent quite a lot of time listening to those frontline police officers talking about what they loved about their job and what they found difficult about it. And I toured all the police stations, and I met all of the staff who work there, including the non-sworn police staff. And when you see what they're doing, the idea that you could cut, you know, millions of dollars out of that and not have an impact on the frontline police officers in uniform is just a fiction. You know, making sure that police have all of their files ready when they show up in court might be a back office function, but it's pretty critical to those frontline police staff because it means that they can then get back out on the beat. One of the most frustrating things for police is showing up and spending a day sitting outside a courtroom to go into the court and then have the judge say, oh, we're missing pieces of paperwork, so you've got to go back and find those, and come back and spend another day sitting outside the courtroom again. Because every time a police officer is sitting outside a courtroom, they're not actually out on the street doing their jobs. Yeah. And so the back office is pretty blimmin' critical in that regard.
Yeah. Chewy, I'm going to shut up.
Just off that last comment, Chris, my mum works for corrections, and I think she'll 100% back what you've just said there, that if it's not for the backroom people, then the courts just lock up. It just doesn't work. The whole thing falls apart. The question I have for you, the election, we had you coming off a very difficult transition into leadership, probably an unexpected transition into leadership. And you had National and ACT, and New Zealand First were burbling away there, but they weren't the main offenders, just really hammering home, I guess, some very pervasive myths about Labour and a left-leaning government. Bad at numbers, overspending, soft on crime, all the same things that are always dragged out in an election. And yet, what we didn't see was really you guys singing your wins. You were kind of, in our eyes, playing defensively. Do you recognize that as well? Or is there a point when you're the government that you just can't come out swinging and going, look, we kept a whole bunch of you alive and in your homes and in your businesses during COVID. Nobody else has ever dealt with this. Actually, compared to everyone else, we're doing really well. Where are your figures that you're coming at this from? Because you guys borrowed during the global financial crisis more than we borrowed for COVID, that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Look, I mean, there's lots that I'd go back and do differently if I could. You know, that 9-month period was a bit of a baptism by fire, you know, and, you know, there are plenty of things that I would do differently in that time if I could go back and do that again. But I mean, ultimately, I think, you know, what's happened since the election has actually proven that the stuff that we were doing wasn't wrong and the things that we were saying weren't wrong. You know, Nicola Willis was hammering us for borrowing too much money. Well, this year's budget borrows more money than 5 of the 6 budgets that we delivered. So, you know, there was only 1 year where we borrowed more money than Nicola Willis is borrowing this year, and that was the year we had to deliver the wage subsidy during the peak of the global pandemic. So this idea that somehow we were reckless with borrowing money when she's borrowing more money than we did in all but one of our budgets, I think just shows that what they were saying was wrong. But also they're trying to boil this down. And you see them doing it on the news every night, where they're trying to compare the government's finances to a household budget. And it's just crazy. Actually, the government finances are not like a household budget. It's very, very different. And so this idea that, oh, well, you know, it's difficult times and everyone at home is having to make savings, so we have to make savings too. Actually, the savings that you're making are the things that are contributing to the financial pressure that Kiwis or families are under, not the other way around. And so I just think that, certainly one of the lessons for me was probably to tackle them more forcefully on some of that stuff. And I started to do that during the election campaign. So you would notice, actually, I mean, it's been plenty of commentators have written about it. Between the first leaders' debate and the second and the third ones, I became much, much more assertive in pushing back on the nonsense that they were out there pushing. And probably
we noticed.
One of the things I would do differently if I could go back again was I would be a bit more assertive right from the beginning on that stuff.
And to be honest, Chris, not to sound negative, when we saw that, we were like, where the fuck has this been? Where has this been for the last 6 months? Speaking of things that you'd do differently, capital gains tax. It's a good idea. It's good policy. It's popular. Is that one of the things that you might have reconsidered looking backwards, or do you still stand by no capital gains tax?
I think ultimately, it's a tricky one. I probably think we should have gone into the election campaign with a different tax policy to the one that we did go into the election campaign with. And so that's one of the reasons why I've said since the election, let's go back and let's look at this again. So blank piece of paper, let's start again. Fundamentally, the challenge of New Zealand's tax system is that it's a very unbalanced tax system when we look at the countries that we would typically compare ourselves to. We place far more emphasis on taxing salary and wages relative, in terms of the overall pool of tax that the government collects than other countries do. We don't have, the different forms of taxation that Australia, the UK, the US rely on a daily basis. We don't. And that means that actually there's a chunk of people who pay a lot less tax than others. And I think that is an anomaly we have to fix. At the moment, the debate we're having as the Labour Party is how best to fix that. But some form of taxation of the earnings that are not currently taxed has to be part of that answer.
All right. Something for you as well, because I mean, you guys obviously do this, but because we see everything and talk about everything, mull over everything, there was a moment in the election campaign where Mr. Luxon was very, very keen to tell the nation that, the CEOs don't like Labour. The CEOs don't like Labour. And here in the show, we were like, this used to be the party of the factory floor. What's where Labour's roots are, the party of the factory floor. You can have the CEOs, will be the party of the factory floor. Has Labour lost that a little bit? And do you need to get some of that back?
I think one of the things I get frustrated by is the idea that Labour is not still really connected with working New Zealanders. The reality is that New Zealand has this thing against the notions of class, which I think is quite interesting. So in the UK, if you go to the UK, people would proudly describe themselves as working class. In New Zealand, no one proudly says, I'm a working class New Zealander. It's just not part of the Kiwi psyche. But the idea that Labour isn't in touch with the working class is, I think, really wrong. And it's based on
hang on, let me say it this way then. The appearance out and about is that there is a difference, a disconnect compared to what there once was.
Well, but see, I think the disconnect is that people are thinking about a definition of a working class New Zealander.
Okay.
That might have been true 40 years ago, but isn't now. The nature of low and middle income New Zealand has fundamentally altered in the last 30 or 40 years. The proportion of people working in factories is much, much smaller than it used to be. The proportion of people working in big workplaces is much, much smaller than it used to be. In fact, a lot of the people who are doing kind of manual labor type work are actually self-employed contractors and regard themselves as small business people rather than working class people. And so I think we have to think about how we make sure we're actually representing those people, because some of the people who are self-employed are actually the people who are earning the lowest incomes and working the longest hours. And if the Labour Party is not in it for them, then who is? And so we have to actually make sure that we're talking to and connecting with that segment of our workforce.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah. So that's one of those myths again, though, isn't it? That National are the party of business. They're not the party of small business.
No.
They're the party of finance businesses.
Absolutely.
And real estate businesses.
Yeah, but what was interesting, as a minister, you do spend a bit of time, out and about around the corporate sector as well. And that was a bit of an eye-opener for me, because I actually found that a lot of those chief executives, when I talked to them, they're actually talking about many of the same issues that I would talk about if I went to the smoko room at the Watties factory. You know, they're talking about their kids' education and their experience of it. You know, they'll talk about the fact that one of their kids broke their arm and they ended up in the A&E over the weekend, and they'll give you their experiences of the New Zealand health system. You know, they're actually talking about many of the same issues that I would encounter working in, you know, talking to a group of blue collar workers. So, you know, New Zealand is a bit of a village in that regard.
I'd like to know how you describe the conflict between Israel and Gaza at the moment. How do you actually describe what's going on?
I think that Israel's actions are manifestly unjust and unjustified. I think that it is a conflict that must be brought to an end. I think it's brutal and horrific what's happening to the people in Gaza, who really have no choice and nowhere else to go. You know, I think that the Hamas attack that started all of this, what was it, 8 months ago or so now, was a horrific event in itself. But the response that we have seen from that has been totally disproportionate, and is you know, I think the action that's being taken to hold those accountable for that, you know, is the right stuff. I think the International Criminal Court and so on looking at it, I think is really important.
Would you use the word genocide?
I mean, genocide, the problem with a politician using the term genocide is that when it comes to those ICJ, you know, appearances, there's a particular meaning of that. And there are people whose job it is to determine whether or not it's genocide or not. And so it certainly is horrific, unjustified. And if the legal proceedings determined that it was genocide, I wouldn't be surprised by that.
Speaking of the legal proceedings, International Criminal Court wants to bring charges against Hamas for war crimes and wants to bring charges against Netanyahu for crimes against humanity. Are you comfortable with both of those? Are you comfortable with Benjamin Netanyahu being charged with crimes against humanity?
Those are ultimately, you know, yes, but those are ultimately matters that I don't make those decisions. That's a legal process.
But yes, you're comfortable. Like if Benjamin Netanyahu, look, I'm not asking you about Hamas because we all know Hamas committed an atrocity, a war crime. Like I think that's goes without saying. But the one that doesn't go without saying for many people is the Benjamin Netanyahu one. So that's why I'm asking you about that. You say you're comfortable if he was brought up on charges of crimes against humanity, you'd be comfortable with that.
Well, yes, because I mean, when you're bombing citizens, innocent civilians who have nowhere else to go, then any leader who knowingly does that should be held accountable for that.
And what should New Zealand do ultimately right now? What stance should we take? What action should we take, if any, as to what's going on over there?
I think New Zealand's been a bit slow to the party. And, you know, I think the stance that we're taking now is better than it was 6 months ago as a country. And one of the things that I got really frustrated with after the election was as we saw that unfold and we saw it getting worse, I wasn't able to really say anything as the caretaker prime minister without the agreement of the incoming government. And in the end, I just thought they were far too slow in actually saying anything meaningful on it. So I ended up making a statement as the leader of the Labour Party, which was a little bit constitutionally tricky because I was still the prime minister at the time, but wasn't speaking as prime minister. But I do think New Zealand should have a strong independent voice in this. I think, you know, an independent foreign policy means exactly that. It means that we speak from our values. And when I look at what's happening in Gaza, that's not consistent with New Zealand's values and the values that we've long held in the world. I think that we've seen more recent signals out of the government that they're willing to say something and do something, but it still feels like they're waiting for the rest of the world to join them before they actually show any leadership on the matter. And I think that, you know, what's the point of saying we've got an independent foreign policy if we're not willing to lead?
Shall we?
So one thing I'd love to know, Helen Clark kicked out the Israeli ambassador when Mossad agents were caught stealing identities of dead children and disabled people. What is the yardstick for getting rid of an ambassador, sending him packing? I mean, we've got Russia invading Ukraine and we've got what's going on in Gaza at the moment. those are ones that have had pretty consistent calls to get rid of them back to their own countries.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's a belief in the power of diplomacy that means that you don't expel ambassadors right, left, and centre. Because how will you ever get to peace? How will you ever get to talking? To bring an end to the conflict if there's no one left to do the talking. And so that to me is the kind of the thing that we always have to keep in mind. We have an independent foreign policy. We should be conveying regularly to the representatives of those countries, Israel and Russia and the two examples that you just mentioned, what New Zealand's position is. But we would have no means of conveying that if we didn't have ambassadors here who we could call in and convey that message to. So, and that becomes an interesting challenge around the peace process too, for example. So if you take Hamas and let's just think about Ireland and Northern Ireland and the IRA, if the British people had simply said we're not going to communicate in any way with anyone who's been involved with the IRA, then the Good Friday Agreement never would have been reached. And, fundamentally, if we want to bring peace, at some point, people have to talk.
I'm just smirking because I'm just thinking about the Russian ambassador picking up the phone and speaking to Putin, going, "These Kiwis are getting a bit pissy with me." I don't know how well it would go down. Hey, I want to ask you a question about a story that, to be frank with you, I'm not really completely over yet. Over meaning understand in its entirety, but it does involve labour, and it's the story coming about the allegations that Stats New Zealand are investigating potential misuse of Maori census data. The reason I want to ask you is because what it appears that some of the allegations are is that information was gathered to target Maori electoral voters in Tamaki Makaurau electorate. The allegations were also that marae staff delivered census forms, also included enrolment forms for voters to change from the general to Maori roll. And then participants were given a $100 supermarket voucher, wellness packs, or food parcels to induce them to complete the forms. And it seems like they are also given supermarket vouchers when they completed the forms to switch the roles. And the reason I'm asking you about this is because the seat was a Labour seat and lost by, I think, 42 votes. And this is an update on the story. Deleted social media videos raised fresh questions about allegations of treating voters to free food at marae polling booth linked to a Te Pāti Māori MP. Late last year, it emerged concerns were raised about the use of Manurewa marae as a polling booth during October's general election. New Tamaki Makaurau MP Takutai Tash Kemp, who beat incumbent Labour MP Penny Henare by just 42 votes, was Marai's chief executive. It was the tightest race in the country, and the surprise upset led to a recount. So there's lots going around the internet about this at the moment, but it seems that there's some concerns that maybe some people were enticed to switch to the Māori role at a marae that this candidate was involved with, and then it was a really tight election. Do you have any thoughts or comments on that, understanding even of that?
Yeah, I do. And I think it's important that we separate what is actually perfectly legitimate and stuff that we should encourage, i.e. getting people to complete their census forms and getting people onto the electoral roll. Those are both good things. I think a marae taking an active interest in getting people doing those things is a good thing. With any idea that the information obtained through that process, for example, the census data, could have been used for a political purpose, that's more problematic. Now, it's complicated because there are legitimate uses of some of that data. So the electoral roll data, all political parties sign people up to the electoral roll, and in the process of doing that, they do their campaigning. Whenever we go out door knocking, canvassing for votes, we take enrolment forms because you find a prospective Labour voter, you find out whether they're on the roll. If they're not on the roll, you make sure they are, because actually you want them to be able to vote and you want their vote to count. So that's all legitimate stuff. Census data, though, is very, very carefully protected. So a person doing both of those things and then potentially using census data for a political campaign, that's a big no-no. So if that's happened, and I'm not saying that that's happened, but if that's happened, that would be a big no-no. And then inducements also, you've got to be very careful there around inducements around an election campaign. So the idea that someone could have been offered something in exchange for voting a particular way, that's also a big no-no. So
which I don't think that's the allegation at the moment, is it? I think it's more offered enticements to then sign on to the Maori role. I don't know if the allegations have been quite to then also vote for a particular party.
Yeah, that's right. So I think there's a lot of smoke around this, and at this
Yeah.
point, the smoke hasn't cleared enough for us to figure out what's legitimate and what's not.
Yeah. Lots of people in our chat, and there's lots of you, we're not going to bring up anyone in particular, want us to ask you about the idea of a Maori parliament that Aori started talking about last weekend after the second Maori activation, as they're calling it. You got any thoughts on that?
To be honest, I don't think it's going to go anywhere, and I don't think that even amongst Māoridom there's a particularly strong support for that. King Tuheitia even has said that he's opposed to the idea. He said that just in the last couple of days. So I don't think that's going to go anywhere. I understand the rhetoric at the moment, and I certainly understand the anger amongst a lot of Māori about the way Māori issues are being treated and the way Māori feel that they've been attacked in the last 6 months. But I think the idea of a separate parliament's not going to fly.
So what about then what's happening locally, where this government is looking to enforce binding referendums on councils to say yay or nay to Māori wards? I know the Māori ward is not a Māori parliament, but there's a Venn diagram where they'd maybe slightly cross over in the corner a little bit between those two things. What are your thoughts around the government looking to do that?
Well, Māori wards aren't creating a separate Māori council. They're just basically ensuring that Māori have representation on the council that's already there. And I think there's a real double standard at play here. So, the National Party is saying, well, it's fine for a council to set up, say, a rural ward to ensure that its rural constituents are represented.
100%.
There's no referendum on that. But creating a Māori ward, no, we have to have a referendum on that. The reality is we do have a Māori electoral roll. So there's no good reason why, councils shouldn't be able to set up a Māori ward if that's what they decide is in the best interests of their community. We should treat them the same. And I tell you what, if you actually really want to go to the one person, one vote system, then stopping property owners voting in multiple different districts in the same election, which disproportionately benefits people with a lot of assets and a lot of wealth, that would actually be quite a good way of ensuring that. And I don't see the National Party clambering to do that anytime soon.
If you look at my page, you see my notes here? See my notes? These are my notes for the conversation.
So do you want to grab a snack before we crack into the second hour?
I've probably been through about half of them, Chris. But we thank you for being with us today. So I'll pull back now and stop, even though I've got more I could go to. Would like to maybe get to some of the chat questions from the punters. You're here live, so it'd be great to give people a chance to get access to you. Chewy, if you've got anything else first, though, you want to throw in there, and then maybe we can get to some of the chats.
Not so much a comment, but a personal observation. The biggest sacrificial idol that this country has that we need to solve is housing. Yeah. It is the investment of housing. It is how compromised people are that all of their money is tied up in housing. That's the only way to get ahead in this country. It's an enormous tax black hole. Nobody wants to tackle it. Nobody has any big ideas about it. It keeps money out of other things that could be pushing this country forward. That's, in my opinion, this one man's opinion, that is the big thing. And I'd love to say that I can solve it for you right now, but apart from you giving me the keys to Parliament and I'll come in the back way, I don't know how you do it, but that's what's holding us back.
But if you look at what this government have done, right, so they've dialed back the state house building program. They just cut $500 million out of that last week in the budget. They've reintroduced a big tax break for landlords, which makes life more difficult for first home buyers, isn't necessarily going to increase the supply of housing because there were already tax breaks available for people who are building new houses. The tax break they've brought back is for those who are buying existing homes. So there were already incentives for people to build new homes. They've dialed back the bright line test, which was a form of capital gains taxation for people who were buying and flipping houses for the short-term capital gain. So they've dialed that back. They've cancelled the first home buyer grants. So all of these things, when you add them up, cumulatively, it basically is taking us backwards on housing when we were starting to make some progress. Now, whenever we talk about housing, the National Party will throw Kiwi Build at us. Kiwi Build was, the problem definition was right, i.e. when you've got a housing crisis, you need to build more houses. The overall goal was still a good goal, build 100,000 affordable homes. That was still a good goal, but the mechanism wasn't right. And so we need to own that. We didn't get the mechanism for doing it right. But what we were trying to do with Kiwi Build was actually the right thing to do, which was to make sure we're building more affordable houses.
Yeah, 100%.
But there are some really interesting things that we can do. So I went and visited Simplicity Homes the other day. So Simplicity is a great KiwiSaver scheme, and they've been building affordable rental houses. So not houses for purchase, but houses for people to buy. Simplicity people can, they build them for below market cost. They rent them out for below market rentals. And their Simplicity KiwiSaver savers get the first dibs on the rental places, which means that their rent is actually going back to contribute effectively to their KiwiSaver, to the return that they get on their KiwiSaver. Actually, they're doing it using the methods that what used to be Housing Corp was very good at doing 30 or 40 years ago, which is to build in bulk, fairly standard designs of houses using fairly traditional building materials. So I think we need to kind of get back to doing some more of that. And I think that will actually help us to significantly increase the supply of houses. But everything that this government are doing is going the other way.
All right. Should we get some chats and stuff?
Yeah, before our crowd lynches us. Yes.
Yeah. Right. I did have one more question. I have one more question though. 10 seconds from each of you. 32 felonies. Donald Trump go to jail? Yes or no?
Or should Donald Trump go to jail?
Yeah. 32 felonies.
Anything that stops him being president again.
All right, yours, Chewy.
I want it so bad. I want that to happen so bad, and I just don't have enough faith in the American system to actually see it. Right, question time. From Belfast Child. One question. What practical steps can we take to ensure this truly awful government is limited to one term, brackets, or less? Brackets.
So I'll tell you something that we should all do, regardless of, I mean, it's an answer to this question, but it's also an answer to a bigger question, which is continue to talk to people who disagree with you. Continue to talk to people who have different views to you, because one of the reasons that election campaigns become so polarized and it becomes so hard to shift people is we're all these days encouraged to talk only to the people who already agree with us. And actually, if you want to shift election campaigns, you've got to talk to the people who you disagree with. And so if you want this to be a one-term government, go find people who voted for it and tell them why you think they don't deserve to be re-elected.
Cool. Comment here from Spiderhoof. Kia ora, Chris. Keep up the great mahi. We are all watching and listening and here to help you in the fight. P.S. I'm happy to help you with the social media game. Yeah, Spiderhoof wanted to help out as well. So lots of help out there being offered. And then any more questions in there, particularly, Chewy? Lots of chats.
Sort of segueing out of the Gaza question, would you personally support acknowledging a Palestinian state?
Yes, and we called for that some time ago. So New Zealand doesn't have a form of officially recognising statehood. The way we do that is by inviting ambassadors to present their credentials. And so we have called on the New Zealand government to invite the Palestinian ambassador to present their credentials, and that's effectively the way that New Zealand conveys that we recognise statehood, is by doing that. And so we've said the New Zealand government should do that now.
Cool. Question here from Lurchify. Could Chippy please talk about what he sees as the potential gains in Labour's relationship with Te Pāti Maori and the Greens?
It's an interesting one. When you're in opposition, you're always in this state of, I describe it as co-opetition. So we're sort of competing for votes, but we're also cooperating with one another. All three of the parties mentioned, Labour, Te Pāti Māori and the Greens, we all want to see a change of government. And so we do need to work together to achieve that. But we'll also have areas where we disagree as well. So I've got a very good relationship with the co-leaders of all of those parties. I don't know all of the new MPs. There's quite a few new MPs in both of them, but getting to know them over time. And, I'm absolutely confident that we could work together in government. We've worked well with those parties in government before. So I think, again, over this opposition period, it's a time for us to get to know each other a little bit, and that's what we're doing at the moment. There'll be areas where we can agree on. In some cases, we may even have things where we can go into the campaign and say, hey, look, we've already talked about issue X, Y, and Z, and we're all on the same page on that, but we have a slightly different take on issues A, B, and C. If we can get to that point for the campaign, I think that'll be healthy and positive.
Was this a harder election for that? Because I think there was a little bit of a speed wobble between Labor and Greens, especially over climate policy, tax policy, that sort of thing. And I guess they're wanting to pull you more to the left, and then you're wanting to go more to the centre to pull votes away from National. And I guess it seemed for a little bit that you guys and Greens were kind of having at each other a little bit. Do you think that hurt support?
No, I don't think so. I think we've had a really positive sort of relationship behind the scenes, there are always areas where you disagree. But if I look back on our record on climate change, we've done more. We did more in 6 years than any government in New Zealand's history in that area, and we actually had emissions trending, starting to trend down. I think almost all of the actions this government have taken are going to shoot the emissions profile back up the other way again. But we did that working together, and we had different takes on things. So if you take pricing agricultural emissions, for example, we had a different take on how to do that than the Greens, but we wanted to get to the same point.
I've got another question here. I'm just scanning as we're doing it. Here's a comment from Says, Chippy, you need to be louder about Palestine. It's plausible genocide already. Just a little, someone's writing a speech for you there, Chris, and if you want to pay any attention to that. But here's a question from Doom. Kia ora, Chippy. Do you support NZ joining AUKUS? Seems we've moved towards less independent foreign policy through the last decade through successive governments. SOS of this has been covered. There you go. We haven't talked about AUKUS, so what are your thoughts?
So AUKUS means that there's a couple of bits to that. Do I support New Zealand joining AUKUS? No, absolutely not. Fundamentally, AUKUS is a nuclear-powered submarine pact between Australia, the UK, and the US, and we shouldn't be part of that. We're proudly nuclear-free. Then there is this thing called AUKUS Pillar 2, which at this point, it's still not clear entirely what that involves. It involves new technology and exchange of information about new technology. We don't know at this point what that involves, whether it's even going to be relevant for New Zealand. And if some of those discussions are relevant, whether we would need to be part of AUKUS Pillar 2 in order to be involved in those discussions or not. My own view right now is that I haven't seen anything that suggests New Zealand's got much to gain from being involved in AUKUS Pillar 2. The reason we haven't been absolutely definitive about that is because who knows what AUKUS Pillar 2 actually is at this point. But I'd take a lot of convincing that there's anything for New Zealand to gain from that.
Hey, Chris, it's been fabulous having you on. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you being a part of the show tonight. As is our tradition, we've kept you far longer than we thought we would, but hopefully it's been okay.
It's been great. I'm happy to come back and chat to you again. It's been really good.
Yep. Well, we're here 4 nights a week. We can have you one night, we can have Karen the next night, you then, Karen, then you, then we can just line it up. And maybe slip a Chloe in there occasionally because that's Chewy's favourite. I don't mean to play favourite there, Chewy, but
I've been saying you have completed our lefty leader bingo card now. So it's been great to have you on.
Oh, very good. Very good.
Really appreciate your time. Now, look, really appreciate your time. Thank you for answering straight questions to some of the guys watching live as well. They're here for you. It is literally right now the biggest live show we've ever done. As I speak to you, it's the biggest number that we've ever had live. So they wanted to hear from you. So thank you for coming along and being a part of it. Appreciate it.
Very good. All right. Cheers.
Thanks, Chris.